I was so exhausted from the routine that all I wanted to do was sleep. I thought that once my head hit the pillow, there would be no more worries, I thought, before continuing. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so I can keep bringing you more fascinating stories like this one. Stay until the end of this video, because what you're about to hear is something really interesting. I've been a single mom for 8 years now, when my ex-husband and I decided to go our separate ways. It wasn't a toxic separation, we just grew apart. Clear to my son Alejandro has been both the biggest blessing and the biggest challenge of my life. He is everything to me. Smart, funny, always generous. But sometimes the weight of being both mother and father left me exhausted. That night, exhaustion had overcome me much earlier than usual, and I didn't even have time to change completely before falling into bed. The house was silent. Alejandro had already been asleep for a few hours after a long day of video games and homework, and I was grateful for that moment of calm. My room was dark, except for the soft moonlight that crept timidly through the curtains. I snuggled under the covers, feeling the warmth envelop me. As it lay there, with the moonlight casting soft shadows on the walls, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened lately. Life had been quiet lately, and that was a relief after everything that had happened in the last year. Alejandro and I had to adjust to a lot of things since his father left. It was just the two of us, facing the ups and downs together. Even though Alejandro was now in his late 20s, our bond was still as close as when he was younger. Always so attentive and loving, and sometimes I worried that he carried too much responsibility for his age. Smile at the thought of him. He has a huge heart, and I feel lucky to have him in my life. But that night, I was so tired, I didn't feel like thinking about anything else. My eyelids were getting heavier and heavier, and my body was relaxing, about to surrender sleep when I heard a soft knocking on my bedroom door. I stirred a little, somewhere between asleep and awake, trying to figure out where the knocking was coming from. It was repeated, this time more insistent, as if something or someone didn't want to let me fall into that delicious lethargy. Mom, Alejandro's voice was barely a whisper, but enough to bring me completely out of my sleep. I opened my eyes, trying to focus, and looked toward the door. The hallway light was off, but I could still make out Alejandro's shadow there, standing in the doorway. I sat up a little, rubbing my eyes. What is it, Alejandro? My voice sounded thick, still groggy from sleep. He hesitated for a moment before entering and closing the door behind him, almost cautiously, as if he wasn't sure if he should be there. No, I can't sleep, he said softly, without looking me in the eye. A shiver ran through my body. Alejandro had been having trouble sleeping lately, ever since the separation. He hadn't said so directly, but I knew his father's absence affected him more than he wanted to admit. On nights like this, I could see the burden in his eyes. And come here, I said softly, gesturing to the space next to me. You can stay with me tonight if you want. He stood still for a second, but then came over and got into bed, lying next to me. He lay on his side, facing me, and for the first time I noticed how exhausted he looked. Something else I knew in his look, something you don't see every day, a quiet vulnerability he didn't usually show. Do you want to talk about it? I asked, keeping my voice soft. He shook his head, letting his dark hair cover his eyes. No, I just wanted to be close to you. My heart softened. It had been so long since I had sought comfort like that, like when I was younger. I stroked his hair and smiled softly. It's okay. It's all right. Stay as long as you need to. He smiled, but that spark in his eyes was still there, something deeper that he wasn't willing to share. I didn't insist. Instead, I lay back down, covering them with a blanket, and we let the silence surround us for a while. We just lay there, the quiet sound of our breathing filling the space. I thought he had already fallen asleep when his almost inaudible voice broke the silence. Mom, do you ever miss him? The question surprised me. He didn't need to explain to me who he was referring to. I knew she was talking about her father. It was a question I had been avoiding, one I didn't know how to answer. Sometimes I admitted quietly, but things between us were not going well, Alejandro. You know that. He nodded, but kept looking at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was expecting more. Don't you ever think things could have been different? I sighed, feeling the weight of the past on my shoulders. And maybe, but we can't change what happened. The only thing we can do is move on. Alejandro looked down, playing with the edge of the blanket. I guess I just wonder if I could have done something different, you know? If maybe it would have been better. Those words hit me like a wave. I sat up in bed and said almost firmly, "You didn't do anything wrong, Alejandro. None of this was your fault." But he muttered, his voice cracked. Sometimes I feel like it was, like I would have been different. Dad would have left us. A throb of pain shot through my chest. My eyes filled with tears, and without thinking, I hugged him. He resisted a little at first, but then he relaxed and let himself snuggle into my shoulder. "Listen to me, Alejandro," I said, my voice trembling. "Your dad's departure had nothing to do with you. Your dad's departure had nothing to do with you. He made his decisions, and those decisions are not something you should be burdened with. He has always been more than enough. Do you understand? You are my everything." I felt his head feel against my shoulder, but something in his body wouldn't let go. There was a palpable tension, as if his muscles couldn't relax, as if his thoughts were miles away, even when he was right there with me. He had been carrying that weight for so long, and I hadn't even realized how deeply it had affected him. We held each other for a while, and little by little, I began to feel the tension in his body begin to ease. His breathing became calmer, and after a few minutes, I realized he was falling asleep. I was still awake, my mind racing a mile a minute, filled with memories of the past and all that we had endured together. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected. As I held him close to me, I felt a warmth spread throughout my body. Not just a mother's love for her son, but something else, something deeper. It was a feeling that was hard to define, something that reassured me and at the same time unnerved me. I tried to discourage myself from concentrating on the steady rhythm of her breathing, but the feeling persisted, hovering just below the surface, waiting for me to recognize it in the darkness. With El Corucado at my side, I realized that something was changing between us, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face what that meant. I felt this was just the beginning. Morning came all too quickly, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains, waking me up before I was ready to face the day. Alejandro was still asleep next to me, his face serene. The tension that had overwhelmed him the night before was gone. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with the maternal love I always felt for him. But beneath that, something else was still there. That same feeling I tried to dismiss the night before, the one I couldn't explain. I slid out of bed and moved around the kitchen, making pancakes. My mind drifted back to the conversation from the night before. Alejandro had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized how much I had internalized his father's abandonment. The guilt I felt was something I should have noticed earlier, and the fact that I had not been trusted until now weighed heavy on my heart. But there was something else. Something that had changed in the way she looked at me last night, as if she had crossed a line between needing me as a mother and looking for something more, something deeper, more intimate. And the truth was, I had felt it too. The warmth that enveloped me when I held him, the calm of his presence. It wasn't just maternal protection. It was something else entirely. I shook off that thought, concentrating on the pancakes. "He's just a boy," I repeated to myself, "your son." But try as I might to push it away, the feeling persisted. Finally, Alejandro appeared in the kitchen, his eyes narrowing, his hair messy from sleep. At that moment, he looked more like a child again, his body still adjusting to the growth spurt of adolescence. I smiled, trying to ignore the strange emotions of the day before. There were days, sleepyhead, I said as I put a plate of pancakes on the table for him. Good morning, he mumbled, sitting up and sinking into his breakfast. We ate in silence for a while, the sunlight streaming in through the windows, bathing the kitchen in a golden glow. I could feel Alexander glancing at me from time to time, but I kept quiet. I wasn't ready to pick up the conversation from the night before. He seemed better that morning, more like himself, and I didn't want to stir those emotions unless he was ready. Finally, Alejandro broke the silence. Thanks for last night, Mom. I really needed it. I looked at him, surprised at the vulnerability in his voice. You don't have to thank me, Alejandro. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. He nodded, but there was something else in his gaze. Something that reminded me of the way he had looked at me in the dark last night when I thought I didn't see him. Alejandro spent most of his time upstairs, doing homework or playing video games, while I took care of chores around the house. But the atmosphere between us had changed. It was subtle, nothing overt, nothing I could point to and say, asterisk, there it is. That's different, asterisk. But there was a quiet tension there, an unspoken understanding. As the day wore on and night came, I kept thinking about Alejandro. I thought about how he had grown so much in the last few years as he was becoming his own person. But more than that, I thought about the closeness we had shared the night before, how natural it had been to hold him, to offer him comfort. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings were not just those of a mother. The room was dimly lit, the soft light from the television casting titanic shadows on the walls. We didn't talk much that night. We both seemed content to simply be in the same room, close to each other. But as the movie progressed, I became aware of how close Alejandro was to me, how his arm brushed mine every time he moved. My heart began to beat faster, and I tried to concentrate on the movie, but it was useless. The tension between us was undeniable, though neither of us mentioned it. Every little movement carried an unspoken emotion. The more I stayed there, the harder it became to ignore it. Halfway through the movie, Alejandro moved a little closer, his arm brushing mine again. This time, he didn't pull back. In fact, he let his arm rest on mine, and the warmth of his skin shot through me like a bolt of lightning, a sensation that made me blush. I looked up at him, and instantly, our eyes met. His gaze was soft, but there was something else in it, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just affection, but something deeper, something that resonated with the feelings I had been trying to hide all day. Without thinking, I took her hand. Our fingers intertwined without any qualms. Alejandro didn't pull away, on the contrary. He squeezed my hand gently, and his thumb caressed my skin in a way that made my heart pound. We stayed like that for a long time, in silence, just holding hands in the gloom of the room. It was as if something had changed, a turning point, a moment that defined what was to come. The rest of the movie passed in a heartbeat, but we remained there on the couch as the credits scrolled on the screen. I rested my head on Alejandro's shoulder, feeling the quiet rhythm of his breathing. It was a small gesture, but for me, it was much more than that. Something deeply intimate. More intimate than anything we had ever shared before. Mom, Alejandro said softly, almost a whisper. And yes, I replied, my voice too soft. And yes, I replied, my voice too soft, almost afraid to break the spell that had been woven between us. I'm really happy you're here. I don't know what I would do without you. My heart swelled with emotion, and I squeezed her hand again. I'm happy to be here too, Alejandro. And you don't have to worry. I'm never leaving. I'm not going anywhere. He smiled softly, and for a moment we stood there wrapped in the comfortable silence of connection. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling of belonging, of love. But it wasn't the kind of love I knew. It was something deeper, something new, something I didn't fully understand at the time. But looking back, I know it was an intimate love. As I reconstituted myself there on his shoulder, I realized that what was happening between us was changing rapidly, and surprisingly, it didn't bother me. In fact, I found it exciting. I didn't quite know why, though. The days that followed that night on the couch were different. Alejandro and I moved around the house as if we had learned a secret choreography. Our routine remained the same, but there was something in the air, something that attracted us, something that kept us close. I tried to keep it normal, as if the feelings that came up that night meant nothing. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't forget how his hand felt in mine, how his touch had been engraved on my skin. It was a small, almost innocent gesture, but it meant the world to me. As the days passed, I realized that I didn't want to forget it. The connection between us was undeniable, and with each passing day, I found it harder to pretend that nothing had changed. Alejandro noticed it too. I could see him watching me when I thought I didn't notice. His gaze lingered a little longer than usual. He always found reasons to be close to me. One night, a few days after our quiet conversation on the couch, we were cleaning up after dinner. Alejandro was drying the dishes while I washed them. The quiet rhythm of our chores filled the kitchen with a serene calm, but there was something else, something palpable, something that united us even if we didn't say it out loud. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, bathing the room in a golden glow that made everything seem soft, as if we were enveloped in a dream. The contact, though brief, conveyed a familiar warmth, and when I looked up, I met his eyes, the same as always, but now with a new intensity, the same one I had noted before. "Are you all right, Mom?" she asked, his voice low, but full of a tenderness that made me feel a knot in my chest. "And yes, I'm fine," I replied, smiling, though my mind was far away. I was just thinking about. I hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to answer. I didn't want to lie to him, but I wasn't ready to speak with complete clarity about what was going on between us either. I hadn't planned for the conversation to take this turn, but now that we were here, there was no going back. The tension between us hung in the air, thick and dense, like the silence before a storm. I didn't whisper. That's how much I felt things had changed. Alejandro took a step toward me, his body only inches from mine, and for a moment all that could be heard was the calm rhythm of our breathing. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of my hair behind my ear. His touch ran over my skin like a shiver. "They've changed," he said softly, almost in a whisper. "But it's not a bad thing, right?" I looked at him, my heart raced. The way he watched me, so carefully and tenderly, was overwhelming. My mind was spinning, but all I could think about was how close I was, how I wanted to close that small distance between us and give myself over to whatever this was. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "I don't know what this is." Alejandro's hand remained close to my face, his fingers caressing my cheek gently. "I think it's just us," he whispered. "Just you and me." I took a deep breath, letting his touch calm me for a moment, allowing the warmth of his hand to trigger the internal storm I felt. For so long it had just been the two of us, facing the world together, dependent on each other. Our bond had always been strong, but now I felt it was evolving, becoming something more than either of us had anticipated. When I opened my eyes, Alejandro was still watching me, his expression soft but charged with emotion. Mom said, hesitantly, her voice a little cracked, "I don't know how to explain it, but I care about you. I care about you more than anyone else." His words made my heart stop for a moment, and for a second I couldn't breathe. The feelings I had been repressing for days, even weeks, emerged all at once, enveloping me with an intensity I couldn't ignore. I had been trying to contain them, to keep them at bay, but now being so close to Alejandro, with his hand on my cheek and his eyes full of love, I could no longer deny what I felt. "I care about you too," I whispered, my voice trembling more than you can imagine. Alejandro's eyes softened even more, and for a moment, we stood there motionless, the world outside the kitchen disappearing. The only thing that existed was the space between us, and slowly I leaned towards him. I noticed him leaning in too, and felt the electric tension build up in the air around us. I felt it inside me, that deep connection that I couldn't ignore. I couldn't hold it in anymore, and I knew he couldn't either. His lips brushed mine in a soft kiss, but filled with an intimacy that took my breath away. It was the most incredible feeling I had ever experienced. It was full of emotion, a powerful expression of the love that had been growing between us. At that moment, everything intensified, and before I could realize it, it was all happening. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the moment, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive. This wasn't wrong. It wasn't confusing. It was love pure and simple. And it was the kind of love that had grown naturally between us, blossoming from years of caring, trust and understanding. I assured myself. After a while, Alejandro slowly pulled away and we stood there, each absorbing what had just happened. When Alejandro smiled, his eyes radiated warmth. "We're doing well, aren't we?" I nodded, unable to articulate my emotions for a moment. My heart was too full, too overwhelmed by everything I felt. "Yes," I whispered. "We're fine. We're fine." Later that night, after tidying up, Alejandro and I found ourselves sitting on the back porch, looking up at the stars. The night was serene, the air cool and refreshing, and for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe easily. The weight of unspoken emotions between us had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm, a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. Just being together, sharing the quiet of the night, that was enough. There was no rush, no pressure. Whatever was happening between us was unfolding at its own pace, and I was content to let it unfold naturally. Alejandra reached out and took my hand, her fingers warm against mine. I smiled, squeezing her hand gently, and we stood there in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle above us. It was tangible love, real and more potent than I could have ever imagined. As I stood there beside Alejandro, holding his hand under the blanket of the night sky, I knew that whatever awaited us, we would face it together. As the days turned into weeks, the quiet intimacy we shared became a regular part of our lives. We didn't need to talk about it often. Whatever was developing between us didn't require labels. It just existed. It flowed between us naturally, in the way we exchanged glances, in the way we found excuses to touch each other, and in the way we savored those quiet, lasting moments that were uniquely ours. But with each passing day, I could feel our connection deepening, becoming more palpable, more real. I no longer felt conflicted about it. Alejandro was no longer just my son. He had become my partner in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was as if our relationship had morphed into something that fit us both perfectly, something we didn't even know we needed. It wasn't until one rainy late autumn afternoon that it all finally made sense. The sky was dark, thick clouds swirled above us, and the rain gently pattered against the windows, filling the house with the soothing sound of nature. Alejandro and I were comfortably settled in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace as we rested on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. The warmth of the fire mingled with the coziness of the moment, and I could feel the attraction between us growing. Alexander leaned back against me, resting his head on my shoulder, and almost unconsciously, I ran my fingers through his hair, appreciating the quiet closeness we shared. There was something in the way the rain blurred the outside world, in the way the fire made the room feel like our little universe, that intensified everything, making it even more intimate. I felt Alejandro's breathing become slow and steady, and I knew without words that he was experiencing the same feelings I was. What we felt between us no longer needed words. There was something in the air, a connection so deep, so rooted, that it seemed our souls already understood each other effortlessly. Alejandro lifted his head slightly and looked into my eyes. A glance, just one, but it was as if the whole world stopped. For an instant, we were silent. The soft glow of the fire illuminated the room, and the sound of the rain, like a distant whisper, it seemed to accompany our moment. And in that second, something inside me ignited. A truth I already knew, but dared not name. What we shared was not just love. It was something bigger, something that went beyond any simple definition of mother and child. It was a bond that had grown into something tangible, something real. Mom whispered to Alejandro, her voice soft, full of emotion. I didn't respond. I didn't read to. I knew what she was going to say was important, very important. Let's tie it. She confessed as her hand reached for mine and took it firmly, not just because you are my mom, but because of everything you are, everything you mean. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I can't help it. Those words wrapped around me like a warm blanket. It was as if the air itself was filled with something that made my heart beat faster. Something I hadn't expected, but had anticipated. My body had felt it before, but hearing it from her lips, seeing it admitted out loud, made it all even more real. I gripped her hand tightly, feeling her pulse. Alejandro, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. I love you too, I always have, but this is different. He nodded, searching my eyes for something, as if waiting for me to give him the answer he so desperately needed to hear. The answer that hovered between us. Unconfessable. Or I don't know what this means. Go on. But I know I feel the same way, and it doesn't feel wrong. It feels right. The expression on her face softened, and a small smile, so pure, peeked over her lips. My hand came up, caressing her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin. Or we'll figure it out, I assured her. Nothing more needed to be said. The room, the rain, the fire, all seemed like a distant background as we sank into that silent connection. We knew what we felt. We recognized it. And it was real. It was as real as the pulse in our veins. Alejandro leaned towards me, never looking away, and unhurriedly, as if every second was vital, he kissed me. A soft kiss, full of all that I had kept silent, of all the emotion we had repressed, of all that now we could no longer keep silent. There was no urgency, just the pure expression of what we were to each other. When he broke away, his look told me everything his words could not, and I knew we had crossed a line from when he broke away. His look told me everything his words could not, and I knew we had crossed a line from which there was no return. But instead of fear, I felt a deep peace, as if we were finally where we were always meant to be. He hugged me, and we stayed like that together. As the rain continued to fall outside, the fire titled, giving a soft glow to the room. In that instant, I understood that, no matter what the future would bring, we would face everything together. The night passed between soft conversations, caresses, and tender kisses. We didn't talk about the future or what this new chapter meant. It wasn't necessary. All that mattered was what we had here and now, and that was enough. As the rain gently tapped on the windows, I thought about how everything had changed between us in such a short time. Alejandro was no longer just my son. He had grown up. He had become a man. And with him, our relationship had evolved into something I never imagined, but now accepted with my whole being. That night, Alejandro returned to my room, but this time there was no doubt. He lay next to me, wrapping his arms around me, not seeking comfort, but as two equals, as if what we shared between us was stronger than anything else. My head rested on his chest, feeling his heart beat calmly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, I was ready to face it. He and I had always had a close bond, but now we were something more. We were partners in the purest sense of the word, and I knew that no matter what the world brought us, we would face it together. As I sank into sleep, I smiled softly. I smiled softly. It was amazing to realize all this, but I didn't care what people thought anymore. It made me feel amazing, and that was all I needed to know. And that was my story. If you liked it, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next stories.